If you missed class today, it's going to take more than this video to cover all the material. Chapter 12 had a lot of material on a very simple level. Now, I'm fully aware that you've learned the majority of it in your U.S. history class, but there is a lot of material. And we're talking about the first half of the 20th century. And I'm going to be an English teacher for a few seconds because there's no other quote I can think of that personifies the first half of the 20th century than Dickens in Tale of Two Cities when he wrote, "It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair." And there's validation. I should not be an English teacher, but in a sense, it was the best and the worst of times. Now, this particular chapter dealt with the worst of times, so I'm going to give you a whole lot of calamity, a whole lot of ugliness here. And hopefully in class you got the details, but just a reminder, World War I, the worst conflict the world had ever seen, 1914 and 1918. Hopefully you remember that mania, militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, assassination of Franz Ferdinand were the causes. It was the bloodiest war at that point in history, 20 million casualties, the two sides, allies versus central powers, industrialized weapons. Here's a tank. And again, those same industrial processes that can make sewing machines and toasters can make weapons of death. Some felt it was the war that would end all war because it was so brutal, didn't exactly work out that way. And here's a very AP term, total war. Total war, by definition, you have mobilization, refusal to compromise, this blurring between civilians and soldiers, and this total control of society by its leaders. So you could make the argument, I think it's an easy argument, that World War I was a total war. Worst thing the world had ever seen. So it ends. And the leaders, well, some of the leaders, they didn't invite Japan, met at the Treaty of Versailles. And I hope you get to see Versailles in your travels, and it's an amazing place. But this, you could make an argument, of one of the worst decisions in history because it laid the groundwork for World War II. If they had a more well thought out agreement, it could have avoided the problems in World War II, which we're going to talk about. So, Treaty of Versailles, it ended the war, but it was very short-sighted, and you could make an argument that it did have a major cause of World War II, but I'm going to push that to a later time for the sake of time. Now, the Russians went on to become a communist nation. It was called the Bolshevik Revolution. Here's Lenin. And Lenin, there was the Red Russians, who were the communists, versus the White Russians, those who were loyal to Tsar Nicholas and that former feudal way of doing things. And the communists won, and Russia became a communist nation. Now, the important year here is 1917 because they pulled out of World War I, and it was America's job to come in and help out. And the analogy I gave in class, I think it's a fair analogy. America in both the world wars was the great relief pitcher of history. And if you're not familiar with baseball, there's a starting pitcher. They go in, pitch 6 innings. Their shoulder goes out, and then a relief pitcher comes in, and if they do well, they get the save. They saved the game. And America came in both wars later, but they saved I'm not going to call it a game, they saved the war. So America, the great relief pitcher of history, as I put it. So anyway, Vladimir Lenin, that man I just showed you, he was the leader of the communist revolution, and he was based on Marxism, this idea that resources should be reallocated. And I've said this before, communism does not work in practice. It looks nice on paper. I read the book in university, but it does not work because it kills the motivation to do better. If all the resources are reallocated, you only do the bare minimum and you don't push yourself to do better like in a capitalist society. Okay, now when Lenin died, Stalin takes over. Now, Stalin, he ruled the Rus for a long time, 1929 to 1953. He was a tough guy. His policies were very, very rough. He used fear and secret police, very quintessentially Russian form of leadership. So we'll talk more about Stalin in the next couple chapters as well. And this word collectivization, which is at the root of failure of communism. So I know we're not farmers. We live in Livonia or Detroit or Southfield. I know there's not farms where we live, but if you were a farmer and you were growing, it doesn't matter, corn, in a capitalist society, the more corn I grow, the more money I will make. So if I'm feeling a little tired and want to pack it in, I might work a little harder to make more money, right? So with agriculture being collectivized, people grew the minimum. It killed the incentive to grow more, and it resulted in mass starvation. So, when you collectivize resources, it really fails in the agriculture department. And unfortunately for the Russians and the Chinese, mass starvation because of this collectivization policy. Now, the global Great Depression, the analogy was a fist. Okay, if I flick you with one finger, it can only hurt you so bad. If I hit you with all five of my fingers, I can knock you out. So, 1929, 1939, global Great Depression, and the five things in conjunction: the stock market crashed, this inequality of wealth, protectionism, overproduction of agriculture, and the Treaty of Versailles, and how Germany got taken out of the economic, I don't know how you put it. Germany was one of the main economic powers. They got removed. So you put these five things together, you get the global Great Depression. We went into great detail in class. Hopefully you remember that. Okay, so fascism. Fascism is a way of thinking, and it's not a good way of thinking. And these fascists emerged during the 20th century. Some really, really bad guys. Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, Pol Pot, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Tojo. These are not good guys. And I'm going to simplify it here for the sake of time. It's essentially you have total power. You will not take any dissent. There's one news source. Essentially, you do it my way. That's it. There's no conversation, my way or the highway. People will only buy into it when circumstances are really dire. Okay, if the classroom was on fire and there was some real horrible emergency, you wouldn't ask me, okay, kids, the class is on fire. Let's sit down and talk and have a committee to figure. You're probably going to want me to say, you out the window, you out the door. There's moments that you need to be my way or the highway. So, unfortunately for the people who were subject to these fascist leaders, it didn't end well. It was really rough. Now, Mussolini is probably the godfather of Mussolini, or of fascism, excuse me. He actually wrote a decalogue about how to be a fascist. He was a journalist before he was a political leader. And I wrote this here. So he essentially came up with this idea of, hey, I'm running the show my way or the highway. The Nazi Party emerged. Now, the Germans after World War I were quite frustrated. They were jobless and hungry and being raked over the coals over the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler, who was a very devoted soldier in World War I, emerged and created this Nazi Party, and they took over in 1933, and they were fascists. And they told the people, hey, you can be proud of being German. We'll get you a job. We'll get you some food. And people bought into that and they kind of disregarded the horror that they committed. And Hitler, people didn't know that he was born in Austria. People think he was born in Germany. He wasn't. Now, Hitler, we learned about one of the most evil men in history. Millions of people died because of his beliefs and his policies. An evil, evil man. We talked about him in class. Now, in Japan, we get this revolutionary right. Here's a real AP term. That we get this radical nationalist fascist movement that emerged to say Japan above all else. And here's the thing. I think they were getting a little big for their britches because Japan had so much military success, really from the Meiji Restoration until World War II. So we see this fascist movement happening in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, in Spain. So fascism was on the rise. Now, World War II emerges in 1939, and there were two theaters. There was the Pacific Theater, and then there was the European Theater. Now, the Pacific Theater is marked by island hopping, where you're going from island to island to island. And this is mainly, for the Allies' perspective, against Japan. And bear in mind, America got into the war because of Pearl Harbor, and we ended the war with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that was the Pacific Theater. And then there's the European Theater. Two different, I don't know if I sometimes I'm a little reluctant to use the word theater, but that's what they were called. It seems like, like you're watching a show, but that's what the name of them. So they had two very distinctive ways of fighting. The European theater was more landlocked, whereas the Pacific Theater was island hopping, planes and boats and that kind of thing. And again, the two sides, you had the Allies versus the Axis powers. So the Allies remained the same from World War I. The name changed in World War II. And then you had VE Day, the victory in Europe. Okay. Now, one of the most horrible things that happened, maybe the most horrible atrocity in history, was the Holocaust that went on for 12 years and 13 million people killed, including over 6 million Jewish people. And it followed the 10 stages of genocide. I know we went into great detail, the 10 stages of genocide. I'm not going to do it now. An absolute horror show. And we went into it enough, you know this. After the war was over, communism emerged in Eastern Europe, and you see this split called the Iron Curtain. This was the Eastern Bloc. So the world really got split in two post World War II, the communist world and the capitalist world. And this went on from the 1940s until either the early 90s, late 80s. In fact, it's safe to say I went to high school. I graduated in 92. So my high school years, you really saw the changes where you saw, East and West Germany unify. We saw the breakup of the USSR. A lot of changes happened in my high school years. So it's about 45, 50 years of Cold War. Ho Chi Minh emerged in Vietnam and is the leader of the communist Vietnamese. Eventually, America goes on to fight in Vietnam. So we see these communist leaders emerging in different places. It happened in Vietnam, happened in Russia, happened in China, part of this Cold War split. And the world, as former colonies were decolonizing, there's a bit of a competition where the communist nations wanted these new nations to be communists and the capitalist nations wanted to be capitalists. That's for another day. The Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong, he created this revolution that was super destructive. Again, collectivized regimes don't end well, but Mao Zedong was able to hold power till 1976. These communist leaders had some pretty rough policies, but they had some staying power sticking around. Now, Mao Zedong, the way he got people on board, it was a long walk. He literally would walk village to village to convince people of communism is the way to go. But bear in mind, when you have nothing, a little is better than nothing. That's simply why people would adopt communism. He talked to people who were quite poor, peasants, and they would say, okay, yeah, a little's better than nothing. And at this point, I have nothing. And eventually, he took control of China with those who were against communism fleeing to Taiwan. And the debate continues, and China says Taiwan is part of China, and Taiwan says it's separate. And this rigmarole has been going on a long, long time. Now, Kuomintang, very AP term. This was the ruling Nationalist Party that it was part of, and they struggled to unify and modernize China. And so you understood from last chapter how bad it was for China in the 19th century. This is a group trying to make things better. Okay, so I know I did not give a lot of detail because there's just a lot of stuff. However, this material, most people learn well. It's interesting, number one, and B, you probably already learned a lot about it in U.S. history. So if you did miss class, go into a little more detail in this video, and these are the terms I need you to know before we move forward. I know it was the real negative side of the early part of the 20th century, but it was a pronounced negative side. We'll get into some more positive things as we move ahead. So anyway, thank you for watching.